Okay, this recording is going to be a bit idealistic, and then at the end, I'm going to go back and clean up the overshoot of the idealistic reduction of what's going on. The reason why I'm creating an idealistic model to talk about, or setting it up as an idealistic paradigm, is because also uh, that's out of necessity, because any intellectual position has to essentially um, be in, be intuitively grounded. There is no such thing as a position that isn't a faith-based position. Essentially, um, you can't, as Jordan Peterson has sort of described in perhaps another sort of technical way, but essentially you can't even see the world without first coming to it with some kind of, in some sense, a set of Platonic ideal forms that uh, allow you to categorize what it is that you're even perceiving. So, yeah, man, this is a tangent, but let me not touch on that now. Okay, so the reason why I also use the idealistic paradigm is because I think that, well, I'm somewhat creating a narrative, which is easier, I think, than to understand what's going on. Um, or it's easier to sort of have an overview. I think, or this is striving to be a comprehensive overlay of what's going on. So I think that the the general gist of the beginning of the story is that right now culturally we are suffering from a hangover of, let's say, social engineering, which was orchestrated via um, legal scaffolding, that the law was used in order to facilitate a kind of social engineering. And since that scaffolding has, since those guardrails have been removed, um, culture has been needed to take the place of what essentially statism thereto before was providing. So essentially, because of the infantilism, the kind of the de facto infantilism that was being perpetrated by the state's organ of coercive measures of the judiciary and law enforcement, that was kind of setting the tone of the structure of society, because that structure of society was not being provided purely from culture, but it was being augmented by the state. I think that this has generally precipitated the decline of religion. I think actually that this has been why, let's say, an insipid culture of sort of mediocrity that is sort of based on this de facto external locus of control provided by the state, um, has inculcated into individuals, um, that have been essentially imprinted by this. Um, I'm not going to explain this concept, so I'm just going to sort of name drop it, but essentially the culture of admiralty law, but which is what I've also described in other recordings as the Napoleonic adaptation of law, or the Napoleonic uh, slide, in that it doesn't just contain itself within the legal paradigm, it becomes the kind of the uh, the compass through which culture eventually follows. Okay. So in some sense, the problem is that our culture doesn't know how to deal with this toxic form of feminism that now exists within the culture, which I've also described in other recordings, has built within it the kind of the fascistic politics and the fascistic relation uh, and conceptualization of society and culture. Um, I mean, I can give some strange um, examples of this. Um, in a sense, the weird thing is that when you're allowed to utilize an external locus of control um, in your subjective narrative, you've kind of got a bit of a toxic relativism paradox there between objective and subjective, but moving along from that little uh, sort of bottomless rabbit hole that creates on a kind of on a purely sort of intellectual level. But essentially, when you've got a shared locus of control, that is also another version of an external locus of control. And so if people have got an ideological narrative that is premised on an external locus of control, that means that self-denigration, at least in the objective claim about, or in terms of your narrative, self-denigration is a claim for um, uh, self-denigration can be transmutated into a claim uh, for justice or a claim against injustice. And so, and also that self-denigration can create a kind of, can be ideologically transferred into, let's say, a bank account or into a source of value, which you could call a kind of ideological identitarian self-esteem, which is owed to you by the system or by the external locus of control. But the paradox and the ironic thing is that this source of self-esteem um, is hinged on first an external locus of control, which is already a kind of, you know, in a broader thematic sense, is a fundamental sort of self-denigration. Um, but it's used ideologically as a source of power. So that becomes a kind of its own sort of toxic doom spiral. But anyway, I mean, so that's a bit of an overview of the formula of, let's say, the cultural decadence that we are suffering from. And the weird thing is that essentially, for a very brief time, we had uh, the resolution of these things before these problems sort of cropped up. But in culture, we actually had a resolution to these things, which is that judgment should fall equally upon women as it does upon men, and equally upon all identities. And you could call that judgment in the sense of having an internal locus of control. Um, but essentially, toxic memes were created in order to create enough of a kind of mythologizing around identity where then it was okay for some people to ideologically narrate and describe themselves in this self denigrating way of being prone to an external locus of control. or having a shared locus of control. Um, Using that conceptual instrument of identity. Um, and this spread from the female identity to then intersectional politics. So, what this actually belies, in some sense, is a kind of chauvinism, but it's a very kind of tricky kind of chauvinism under the guise of claiming special rights because of the systemic oppression that is described in the narrative. And let's say the most paradoxical and antithetical claim that associates with this form of ideology is that you're claiming a kind of automatic respect for your identity, which means that the respect will never be delivered to the individual underneath the identity, or respect itself becomes non-respect, becomes just a kind of unknown quantity that is sort of subjectively thumb sucked, or just kind of pulled from the ether, from this kind of toxic relativism paradox, where it has to be fudged every time um, that it's evaluated uh, or tracked in situations. It's a fundamentally disintegrated value at that point. And so, it almost fundamentally undermines respect itself. Anyway, and so, I mean, essentially, you could diagnose the problem in culture as being the fact that if you have a hysterical, sort of ideologically driven woman that is fundamentally invested into this external locus of control and is self denigrating, a man can't mansplain to such a woman. A man is not allowed to contradict such a woman. And by cultural convention, by the cultural norms that exist, that line cannot be crossed. And so that line that can't be crossed is basically the line that's stopping us from actually making progress in terms of having an enlightened culture, is that judgment does not fall equally on men as it does women. Now, just because I say that judgment should fall equally, that doesn't mean that the same consideration should be applied to men and women. Um, because I mean, just to make a little practical aside here, uh, because women do have a more complicated set of issues, especially in terms of modern economics. That if they want to have a kind of, the pressure of modern economics, um, which to some extent you could say happened because of the introduction of women into the workforce, as well, like lowering the real wages of men to some degree, or putting pressure on that by increasing the supply of labor. But combined with, let's say, family. So if you look at the issues of wanting to have a family and wanting to have, let's say, the modern ideal or the middle class ideal of a kind of a woman who has it all, that ideal perhaps has to be reframed and regarded with much more tragic nuance, demanding great sophistication in order to do both well. It needs to be known that that requires a huge amount of sophistication. And you can say, well, men don't have to deal with that level of sophistication in their lives. They don't have to manage that level of sophistication. Um, but again, that is not systemic oppression. I mean, I guess you could call that, to some degree, biological um, oppression, in the sense that women, on average, or something like that, have more internal inclinations which are tragically harder to balance. Um, but it is interesting that, I mean, it does, it makes me wonder sometimes how much women actually want the things that they say they want, and how much that isn't just based on, let's say, the contemporary cultural consensus, that it perhaps isn't just a kind of a sheepish, kind of uh, sort of herd groupthink, because women do seem to be much more sensitive to absorbing uh, simplistic and even prejudiced sort of ways of modeling culture and society, so that they can navigate social conventions um, in terms of maximizing their convenience, which you could say that they have a biological or evolutionary imperative to get a hold on and to master much earlier in life. Um, as when they are at the peak of their sexual market value, they can position themselves in order to perhaps radically advance their socioeconomic standing, perhaps. So what I'm generally kind of describing are the issues that surround hypergamy, or the opportunistic female sexual strategy. This is a bit of a horrible thing. This kind of breaks my flow slightly, but let me just treat this issue as well, as a separate issue, which I've also explored in other recordings. That the main problem um, is, in some sense, that I don't even necessarily think that the problem was that society removed the guardrails that were keeping women in a, let's say, relatively, inverted commas, traditional, inverted commas, healthy cultural um, role in relation to meeting their own desires and expectations, and how they like to interface with society and culture. I don't think the problem um, is just as simple as that society removed the guardrails by removing the coercive measures of law that were suppressing women's cultural potential, and of playing the roles that they could play, of being more sophisticated beings. I think it was actually that that the law itself not only became liberalized, which is something that I'm glad that it did, because I think that this is needed to have an enlightened culture at some point. Um, More on that, but is that they went the other way, and that law was actually used to incentivize, or perversely incentivize, the female opportunistic sexual strategy by not regarding legitimacy in children, the paternal legitimacy of children, by not giving any kind of legal sanctity or status around legitimacy. So therefore, essentially, women did not have to think or worry about developing trust in a relationship or cultivating a mature relationship. They only had to worry about is what are the economic or material um, what was the economic standing of their of the father of their children, because it didn't matter if they got married or not. The legal system would allow them to use children as a way to access resources. And so, and also, let's say that combined with the liberalization of abortion, and I'm not going to make a moral claim about that. I'm just making a claim about the effects of this in terms of the general health of culture and society, is that women have this unilateral um, source of power to dictate and to be able to predictably manage, let's say, the consequences of relationships and reproduction without having to cultivate stable, mature relationships. They don't have to cultivate character and the judgment of character. They only need to be able to judge, what the size of someone's bank account is, essentially. That's the only prerequisite. Um, so the asymmetrical, let's say, structure of the law in society has now, been completely contorted to promote, in some sense, some kind of reparation for the female identity, and this has been done without much thought, And well, in some sense, you could say, well, this can all be supplemented for by culture, and it can. So if the legal situation is fundamentally not conducive to forming a relationship, I mean, you could say that on some level, it is maximizing the fairness of the child, of the infant. It's not maximizing the fairness to the father of the infant, who was perhaps um, lied to, perhaps, or who knows. I'm just I mean, you could chalk that up to, well, these are the consequences of having sex with people that don't deserve your trust if you did trust them, or of having irresponsible sex beyond the bound of a trusting relationship, which is for people themselves to manage and administer on behalf of them. Which you could just say, well, people should know then as well that there are these other obstacles which have been introduced, as in these perverse incentives, which essentially manifest as being further obstacles to having a healthy functioning relationship. Anyway, um, so I'm not even necessarily against these legal changes. I just think that uh, it was perhaps one of the pieces in the narrative that, in some sense, facilitated um, the dissolution of the traditional cultural roles that were defined into a hyper pro feminist, hypergamist sort of ideology. It created the conditions for the manifestation of that kind of ideology. It's interesting to note that perhaps you could say that, I mean, I don't know, perhaps that would have developed anyway, because that is, um, perhaps feminism would have always continued to try to fight the next battle, um, going further than its original uh, intention of affecting equality, and instead, always it was going to try to uh, facilitate chauvinism, under the guise of expanding equality. Anyway, and so what I didn't mention is that hypergamy has, I mean, that's a bit of an overview of hypergamy, but in terms of how it actually operates, it's very psychologically dysfunctional and pathological in that it usually inculcates a kind of a borderline valence of relating to reality, even where you're going to leverage a highly relativistic, subjective um, sense of reality, that you're going to try to force other people to play their role according to that model. And so you have these queen bees that are trying to project onto people expectations, that those expectations are fulfilled out of the fear of uh, such a woman deploying a kind of emotional volatility. So they use kind of emotional volatility to have their narrative be programmed, uh, into their, say, impressionable or environment, because this doesn't exist unless it is actually embedded into the culture itself. And so you need lots of cultural conventions that insulate and that protect this kind of functioning. First of all, you have to have the idea that women are essentially are allowed to be crazy, and you're not allowed to mansplain to them. You need that kind of um, sort of fundamental disequilibrium and inequality, because you need to allow women to basically have this childish way of interfacing with reality and with other people. Um, Everyone has to learn to tolerate this, uh, which is effectively a kind of a form of self-denigration on behalf of women who do this. And then they can sort of transfer that self-denigration into complaints and expectations, which have to be which somebody else has to be accountable to them for. And so it's fundamentally sort of entrenched in this codependency, which is facilitated by a kind of a shared locus of control, which they need to form with essentially the host, that will help facilitate pandering and catering to their subjective narrative, which they will never be responsible for the validity thereof. They never have to fix their narrative except when they want to fix it. So it's like, there's a one-way firewall where commands go from the inside to the outside, but there's no accountability that goes from the outside to the inside. They are immune from mansplaining, as it were. And so we end up with a culture that is devoid of reason and accountability. Um, which is what we currently sit with in the contemporary culture. Now, again, my general overview of this is this you could argue is something like the residue and the after effects, the hangover of having a society that was socially engineered using the law instead of using the culture. So because we didn't have an organic society to some degree, we had guardrails, we had safety rails installed from state power. And now that we have removed those guardrails, we're in a bit of a void. The reason why we're also in a bit of an abyss or in a void is because that when the state was installing these guardrails, it was de facto displacing personal or individual an individual ethic of an internal locus of control. It was destroying, let's say, what should be the cornerstone of Western civilization. I mean, there are degrees and there are degrees. So, I mean, like, I wouldn't say that, it did this in every single part of life. And I need to put caveats into what I'm saying as well later on. But basically, it was de facto infantilizing society, because it was supplementing what culture should otherwise be responsible for providing. And it is, I think, important that these issues are regulated by culture and not the state. Because then, when it's regulated by culture, and culture alone, not backed up by the power of the state, then people themselves are actually living in the situation that they're living in. It's just them and culture is a part of them, so they have cultural power innately. I mean, cultural power works very differently from political power, and then also the importance of the individual within the culture is something that is worth valuing and promoting and keeping sacred in the culture, as it were, to keep a well-functioned, sort of well-regulated culture in which people have a sense of responsibility and control over managing and negotiating what they want in their lives between other individuals. Okay, so there's that. So I do see at the end of this very dark road is perhaps an enlightened culture where these things are going to be, these issues are going to be solved to some degree, and those solutions are going to exist within the culture. But it does require, let's say, a throwaway generation. It requires a bad example. It requires a generation full of people that were decadent and that are seen to be decadent and that are seen to be the consequences of their own bad decisions and bad actions. So, and I think we're basically going through that section of hopefully the process of arriving at an enlightened culture. And again, I think the real solution to all of this is that judgment needs to be able to fall equally upon women as it does upon men. And once we get to that point of parity and equality, then we'll be able to, then we'll have an enlightened culture. But there are a lot of toxic obstacles that are in the way of reaching that point. Identity politics. and this whole sort of tactic of self-denigration. But yeah, sorry, I wanted to say more about the kind of the state being a neo-religious substitute, or you could say it, something of a spirituality substitute as well, because the issue, I think spirituality is something that could be culturally nurtured in people at a much younger age. As soon as the culture does seem to be the highest arbiter on issues, because when you have state power being the highest arbiter, especially in moral issues, you've kind of got a state idolatry or a statist idolatry that is providing to you the guidance to your ethical and moral system. Whereas if these things are cultural issues, then culture is not set in stone. So you are a participant in culture, and therefore you gain access to your internal locus of control and looking at, how responsible you are for things that go on, around you, and how you can perhaps increase your capability to take more responsibility for what goes on around you, which does require um, perhaps partic- certain forms of investigation and searching, and that searching is basically that is the spiritual inclination, or that is the spiritual awareness, and that searching, I think, has been substituted for a long time now, and that's, I think, also why religion is in the general state that it is in, um, because politics has, or at least the coercive measures that the state has um, has negated the use of this individual grounding in reality. Now the caveats, I'm gonna, sorry, this is a bit of a disjointed discourse, but anyway, I'll just continue to plod along. So my so oh no, okay, so let me continue to make this point, or to develop my thesis that so my general theory does have some caveats attached to it, which is that maybe it just so happens that the population itself, built into the population, or sections of the population that have certain personality styles, which are just fundamentally mediocre. They are antithetical to having an internal locus of control, and they're always going to need some kind of elite um, to socially engineer their outcomes for them. Now, I don't personally believe that, but I mean, as a sort of as a technical possibility that perhaps should be spoken about. Now, I do think that this is what is then called for is what Plato would call the guardian class, um, the, uh, the class of people in society that should protect um, the integrity of society, and I obviously I'm going to reimagine what play like in the modern context. How do the guardians operate? Not in the same way that they are described in the Republic, as in the well. Anyway, so the guardian class would be a transparent intellectual elite that is fighting to frame the cultural center, as it were, or the cultural foundation against antagonistic, that, that that's why they're called the guardians, is because they have to protect something. There is something that is worth protecting. So they have to actually hold the center against antagonistic and perhaps opaque, corrupt elites or would-be elites. Now, again, to reiterate my caveat as to, why my theory might be wrong about, and this general notion that I'm putting out is too optimistic, is that it might just be the case that corrupt elites or corrupt would-be elites or plutocrats, essentially, fake elites that are just, that they have too many resources to depend on in essentially capturing a society or capturing a civilization, because there are just too many mediocre minds out there, that the average member of society is so low down that they are in fact demanding an external locus of control. They expect an external locus of control to be fed to them by their corrupt plutocratic elites. And this might also to some degree might not just, these personality styles in the population might also just be a historical residue of, essentially, you could say, dysfunctional, um, developmental, sort of chains of reproducing pathology happening through somewhat a broken family structure down through the generations. And to some degree, and I've sort of, I do think that women do seem to, in obviously this is a generalization, but, and it might just be because of the current culture that we live in, but and that we have inherited, women do seem to have a predisposition to conforming toward, essentially, the some convenient lowest common denominator set of expectations. They want to be able to game society. They want to be able to reliably predict and depend on social conventions, because security is something that you can imagine is an evolutionary and biological imperative for a woman. Because if a woman is going to be pregnant, she's going to be vulnerable. If she's going to have a young infant, she needs to be cared for. So for her to model, she has, let's say, an evolutionary incentive to model and evaluate society in terms of its dependability, its reliability, its predictability. And this sensibility is obviously what leads towards what I've described already as the female opportunistic sexual strategy, hypergamy, um, which has been, let's say, to some degree empowered by the state, by essentially um, giving women all these, essentially, because you see, if you said to women that if you fall pregnant and have a child, and you don't have a relationship with the father, you can still claim access to resources, um, based on his net worth or whatever. Um, and you also tell a woman, well, if you fall pregnant and you don't want to go along with that potential or possibility, you could have an abortion. You have just given complete control. There's no downside to essentially sort of focusing on maximizing, um, operating within such a system to try to maximize your opportunistic surveillance of what you can access. So it's like there's no downside. Like uh, if you have a one night stand with someone who's got flashy clothes and a nice car, and then a week later you work out that the car is a lease, and this guy's got credit card debt. It's like there's literally no way that you can kind of I can't think of the eloquent words, but there's an usually the power of decision and the power of choice is tempered by considerations that force choices to be made uh, uh, I'm just going to vaguely describe this because words are failing me, but essentially that forces your choices to be a commitment to something higher, a commitment to a kind of to something that isn't tangible, to something that is basically a kind of a more immaterial, perhaps sense of character or sense of development. Or what I'm basically saying is that your decisions should have to take into account some sense of judging your own character, which you could also say is the seed of having an internal locus of control. But there is no such um, self doubt uh, when one has a kind of unilateral power in relation to somebody else's choice. So it's like women are choosing for other people, for men, to such an extent within this current, sort of system of relations between the sexes, that power of choice that they have over men in terms of choosing for, whether or not to have somebody else's child, lends itself to such a convenient form of hypergamy, um, that there's just no bar to entry into that mode of relating to sexual relations. And that asymmetry has effectively, I mean, in some sense, the male opportunistic sexual strategy, I think, does develop a, a decent enough counterbalance. That women have to be on the lookout for men who are going to just have sex with them and then disappear. That would be like the general, kind of trope. But now women can cynically not even have to worry about that too much. Um, that isn't a kind of, you know, before you would have to worry about essentially mutually assured destruction. Um, anyway, I'm just basically saying that there aren't any uh, second guess facets and features that puts a dampener onto hypergamy. And this has also created a kind of a cultural cult, an ideology that has um, or that actively promotes uh, modeling society the way that borderline personality disorders model their environment, and conceptualizing it, in perhaps in a bit more of a I mean, in some sense, the ideology of identity politics is really the a kind of a thematic reduction, um, a reductive summary and aggregate of the effect of how borderlines control and manipulate their environment. Um, uh, Let me just. I was writing these things to a friend of mine, so let me just repeat some of the writings because I think I put it much more succinctly and clearly there. But basically, we are being trolled by women's cultural tendency to be more prejudiced and simplistic beings, leveraging cultural rules and conventions to disguise their manipulation through their own subjective narratives of modeling those conventions to facilitate the convenience of self gratification dishonestly, pretending to model culture dishonestly in brackets, pretending to model culture naively and innocently, when instead they are actually doing so opportunistically, using this narrative to get away with an external locus of control, which amounts to scapegoating as per their convenience. Uh, Women are allowed to self denigrate. They act as little girls shielded by their ideological narrative, which describes an external locus of control. If people can't develop a way to shatter these toxic claims, which have insulated themselves with preemptive arguments against mansplaining or other buzzwords, then culture deserves to be dissolved into destruction. There is a huge opportunity to develop an enlightened culture, but it will require a throwaway bad example generation. In some sense, we are dealing with the hangover of social engineering that was built into our society by using the law to structure our societal relations instead of having an enlightened culture, which has had a big impact on substituting for spirituality religion. Statism has been acting as the de facto neo religious substitute, infantilizing the culture and keeping people therefore trapped in a state of perpetual mediocrity in respect to the important themes of accountability and responsibility. Until culture is back in the driver's seat of society, the individual will never be capable of evolving to a respectable level of insight. That's a general claim, obviously. I'm talking about, the general population. In the general population, the individual will never be capable of evolving to a respectable level of insight until culture is back in the driver's seat. Then I said, my theory might be wrong. In some pragmatic sense, there might be too many mediocre personalities to allow culture to go unengineered by some kind of enlightened elite that would be enlightened in a compromised sense, at least compromised relative to my vision of having a properly transparent elite. But I do think it's possible to have a transparent intellectual elite, something like the guardian class as Plato described, playing their role by fighting antagonistic and toxic forms of opaque elites. Sadly, toxic elites have much resources available to them at the moment. It's women, simps, and identity politics buying into their slave morality of an external locus. of control, or a shared locus of control, which is the same thing as an external locus. Or, I mean, if you have a shared locus of control, but you regard yourself as responsible as the collective, I mean, that's the one caveat. Is I guess you could have a shared locus of control as long as that you regard yourself as individually be having a kind of joint and severable view on the notion of responsibility, in which it's both. It's not either. It's both, joint and severable. And so in that sense, you can have a shared locus of control in some sense, but it can't invalidate also your internal locus of control. It has to be kind of a process that your internal locus of control is linked to.